you for inviting me. So, my name is Willis. I'm an associate professor in gerontology at the University of Southampton. Gerontology is the study of aging and the life course. So, I am a social scientist interested in all sorts of things to do with health and well-being of people's old age. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some research I've done on the health of Irish people in Britain. So, my talk is called Still Unhealthy, Still Overlooked, a review of evidence on the health of Irish people in Britain. So, I'm going to start off with a little bit of information about what I mean about Irishness and Irish ethnicity. And then I'm going to get into the main part of my research today, which is trying to find out what has happened to research on the health of Irish people living in Britain, because there seems to have been a change over time. I carried out a state-of-the-art literature review, and the findings I'm going to talk to you about are the trends in research over time on the health of Irish people in Britain, the actual evidence on health, so are they still disadvantaged? I'm also going to look at how the Irish are constructed in the literature from an ethnic identity perspective. And then I'm going to look at some of the reasons for resistance to studying the Irish in research on health and ethnicity over time. So who am I talking about? Well, for me, the Irish in Britain are people who are born on the island of Ireland. So that's either the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland, or even possibly the Free State, and who now live in Great Britain. I'm also interested in people who identify ethnically as one of the Irish categories. So that would be the white Irish category or the white gypsy or Irish traveller category in the census. And also, these could be first generation migrants, second generation, or later. So sometimes people who were born in Ireland identify as white Irish. Sometimes their children born in Britain do as well. But sometimes their children may identify as white British. But some of the studies that I'm looking at do pick up second and third generation people. And I'm also interested in Irish people of colour or mixed heritage. And these tend to be hidden by the census ethnicity categories, the way they're currently set out, where they focus on whiteness. But obviously, there are Irish people who are not white. This is a population pyramid. This is a type of graph that shows the age structure of an ethnic group. So this is from the 2021 census, the most recent census of England and Wales. And this shows that there are quite a lot of older people in the white Irish ethnic group. And actually, they are an older age structured population compared to the average in England and Wales. This is another way of viewing the age structure. This is actually from the 2011 census of England and Wales. But here you can see the white Irish had 31% of their group age 65 or over in 2021, which is actually, again, the oldest age structure in the whole of England and Wales. This is a reflection of migration history, timing of migration. So the groups that came earlier in history have an older age structure, and you can look at the other minority ethnic groups and look at the age structure and see which groups came later, which groups came earlier. But another issue is the fertility, so the number of children being born that claim white Irish ethnicity. And sometimes, as I've said, people who are second generation Irish will put themselves down as white British on the census. So that's also affecting why this figure is low here. So there was a lot of research carried out in the late 20th century looking at health and Irishness, and there was consistently reporting health disparities when comparing the Irish living in Britain with the general population. So a lot of health topics were looked at, including mental illness, suicide, mortality rates, alcohol misuse, self-rated health, and limiting long-term illness or disability. And they were consistently showing inequalities where the Irish were in a worse situation to the general population. Some of this research also showed that the disadvantage persisted into the second generation. So there were high mortality rates shown in not only first generation migrants, but second generation migrants as well, indicating that the sort of common assumptions about assimilation into the host population was not actually happening for the Irish group. So all of this research was part of the argument behind why there was a white Irish category introduced in the census for 2001 for the first time. So therefore we knew we would be able to measure the health status of white Irish people. And then 10 years later, the Irish travellers were introduced into the census in the white gypsy or Irish traveller category. So that all seems like, yes, we should have lots of evidence now about the health of Irish people in Britain. But I think more recently, ethnicity research has tended to neglect the Irish living in Britain. So a study by the King's Fund on ethnic health inequalities in the NHS had information saying we have seen Black and minority ethnic groups continue to lag behind their white counterparts in terms of living long and healthy lives. And this is indicative of several studies and several reports that tended to collapse all of the white groups together into one. And therefore, any findings about white Irish distinctiveness were hidden. I also found some trends where the white British and Irish were put into a single group as if there's no difference between the two groups at all. So some of these papers had a group called White British / Irish. So not even putting everyone together in white, but suggesting that British and Irish is the same. Now, halfway through doing the literature search for this project, I had some of my initial assumptions challenged. So I went into this research thinking that there was a decline in research on Irish health. I found quite a bit of literature, and I thought, okay, maybe I'm wrong. But then at around that time, I found this call from the National Institute for Health and Care Research, the NIHR, on reducing health inequalities related to ethnicity by influencing the wider determinants of health. And I thought, fantastic, this is research funding that I could apply to. But within that, they said, for the purpose of this call, ethnic minority groups are defined as groups comprising people who do not identify as white British or white Irish. So they explicitly excluded the white Irish from this study call. They did include the travellers, it has to be said, but this is just more indication that research on health and ethnicity is not considering the white Irish to be a relevant population. So what did I do? Well, I had 4 research questions I wanted to explore. So I wanted to know, first of all, is my hunch correct? Has consideration of the Irish in health inequality research decreased over time? And then if it had, what has caused this apparent shift in interest in identifying the Irish as a distinct ethnic group that should be included in studies of ethnic health inequalities? Because those studies I referenced at the beginning were all saying we need to include them. Then I wanted to know, are the Irish still worse off in terms of health, or has the cohort aged out of ill health? What does that mean? It means that maybe the people who were being studied in the 1980s and the 1990s and had the worst health have now died, and therefore the population that we're looking at now in, say, the 2020s may be a later generation and a healthier generation. And finally, I wanted to know, how is the ethnicity of the Irish constructed in the literature? So how are the Irish understood in this literature on health and ethnicity? So I carried out a state-of-the-art literature review. This is a particular type of literature review methodology where the aim is to understand where we are in a body of literature and how we got here. It's different from a systematic review. And I examined literature on the health of Irish people living in Britain, published from 2001 to 2023. Why 2001? Because that's when white Irish was introduced into the census, so I thought it was a good starting point. The literature search was very robust. It was designed with the help of a librarian, and 2 people carried out the search. This is a diagram indicating how the literature was obtained. So there was formal database and journal search. There was informal search based on literature I already had, snowballing from reference lists and so on. Then through reducing of duplicates and more recommendations, I ended up with 140 texts in my final analysis. This is actually quite a lot for a literature review, but remember that we're talking more than 20 years here. Now, a state-of-the-art literature review requires a recognition of researcher reflexivity and subjectivity. So I need to have a moment to talk about my position as a researcher, who I am. So I am a white Irish person. I was born in Ireland, lived there until I was 18, and then I moved to the UK. So I am therefore part of the group that I'm studying. I am middle class, educated, middle-aged, living with long-term health conditions and living in Britain. So I therefore have a vested interest in this research, but I need to recognize my own subjectivity and not allow any bias to affect the outcomes of my research. So this is just part of recognizing that in this research methodology. So let's look at some findings. So this graph shows the frequency of the publications over time, so the different publication years from 2001 to 2023. There are 140 articles, as I told you, and you can see certain peaks and troughs in activity. The peaks, for example, in 2004 and 2014, are related to the release of certain large surveys. For example, the Health Survey for England in 2004 had a large sample of white Irish people, so they were able to do analysis on it. In 2014, there was quite a flurry of publications around another survey and also the activity of a researcher who was publishing from their PhD. Here, if we look at the number that actually focused on the Irish in Britain, we can see that the number reduces dramatically. So we have 43 papers that focused on the Irish, whereas in the previous graph, we had papers that looked at lots of different ethnic groups, but included Irish as one of their groups. Again, you can see there are peaks and troughs of activity that reflect the same issues that we saw in the last graph, but generally a lot fewer publications focusing on Irish people, and there is a reduction over time. Within those articles that focused on Irish people, these are the health topics that they were looking at. So the majority of them were looking at general health, so self-rated health or measures like blood pressure and obesity and so on. But then we also have mental health and well-being, which measured things like depression, anxiety, scales like depression scales or mental well-being scales, and use of psychiatric services. There's also a fair number on alcohol misuse. Now, there are two papers on abuse survivors. So these are survivors of institutional abuse in Ireland. These were fairly recent. So there was one in 2017 and one in 2019, and they're from the same author. So this is a newly emerging area of research about the Irish in Britain. Okay, so now let's look at whether the health of the Irish has changed or has it improved. Well, the key headline is it depends on how you measure health. If you look at the objective measures, this does still show disadvantage, whereas if you look at the subjective measures, there are fewer differences. So let's look at the objective measures. So within mortality, there are a lot of studies showing that the Irish, or the white Irish, depending on how they measured it, had consistently higher standardized mortality ratios over time compared with the white British or the general population. So these studies had different comparison groups. They looked at different kinds of cause of death, so lung cancer and colon cancer, for example, respiratory disease, cerebrovascular disease, alcohol-related deaths, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. There was also several studies on suicide. There were important gender differences, so sometimes men had worse health than women in these studies and higher mortality ratios. Also, looking at mental health, there were increasing rates of depression and dementia over time in some of the studies. So some of the earlier studies showed there was no difference, but some of the later studies showed that there was a difference, so perhaps things are getting worse. There was a lot of studies looking at alcohol and showing consistently that the Irish had unsafe alcohol use over time. And interestingly, the studies that looked at within group inequality by socioeconomic status found that the greatest within group inequality was found for the Irish. So that's where they look at not only ethnicity but also socioeconomic status. And then they find that the poorest people in each ethnic group have the worst health. But for the Irish, it was the worst. But then if we look at the subjective measures, these show fewer differences. So for example, limiting long-term illness and self-rated health are either improving over time or the differences are mostly accounted for by other things. So why are these two issues important? Well, those are the two questions about health that you will find in the census. So if you only look at census data, it will appear that the Irish, the white Irish, are healthier in 2021 than they were in 2001. You have to look at the more objective measures in order to see that that is not actually the case. There were several studies on Irish travellers specifically, and they had consistently poor health over time, unfortunately, much worse than the white Irish group. I also wanted to look at how the Irish were understood in terms of ethnicity in the literature, because this could be one of the reasons why the interest may have declined. So how did each of the studies construct this Irish group? So the earlier studies used the country of birth as how they defined Irish people. So being born on the island of Ireland, for example, or some studies had either you're Irish born or you had at least one parent born in Ireland. So that's the second generation were included. And some of the studies in Scotland use Catholic descent as a proxy for Irishness, arguing that a large proportion of the Catholic population in Scotland were originally Irish migrants who came in the 1800s, likely due to the famine. Slightly later in time, the studies are including the Irish as an ethnic minority group. They referred to them as either part of the BME, Black and Minority Ethnic Population, or the BAME, Black Asian and Minority Ethnic Population. Or they were arguing that they should be included because they are one of the largest ethnic minority groups in the country. But some studies explicitly excluded the Irish from ethnic minority groups. So, for example, the study by Aldridge compared three groups: white British, white Irish, and Black Asian and minority ethnic. Now, almost all of the authors assumed Irish people are white. There was only one paper in the whole of the 140 sources that even acknowledged that there are Irish people who are not white, and that was the most recently published source. Interestingly, some authors contrasted Irish with a white group, which you could argue they're suggesting the Irish are not white, but that is possibly linking to the way in the 1800s some Southern Europeans were classed in the United States as not part of the white group. And then some of the studies just had inaccuracies about the status of Irish people in Britain. So some authors included the Irish as internal migrants, or they combined everyone born in the British Isles into one UK group. So it's possible that there was just a misunderstanding of the legal relationship between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom here, and not recognising that they are two separate countries. So then I explored why some of these studies leave out the Irish. So it's possible that the Irish are no longer considered a threat to British identity, and they're no longer constructed as an ethnic other in the same way as they were historically. So historically, I'm talking 1800s and so on, the Irish had been viewed as subhuman, violent, disease carriers. They had a foreign religion. They were disposed to political disruption and terrorism. They therefore represented a threat to Britain and something that needed a policy response. However, after independence in the 1920s and later on the Good Friday Agreement, the political question subsided. Now, immigration law in the 20th century in Britain kept on tightening restrictions on citizens of the new Commonwealth. Now, the Irish were omitted from all of those immigration discussions because under the Common Travel Area, there were no restrictions between travelling from Britain to Ireland. So that may have led to the Irish being left out of research that focused on immigrants. There is an assumption in the literature that Irish people are white, and as discourses about ethnicity and immigration to Britain have largely focused on people of colour, the Irish tend to be left out. However, one does not have to be a person of colour to be an ethnic minority in Britain. As the Irish population have been in residence for a long time, it could be assumed they have assimilated and any health differences have disappeared, but the evidence shows this is not true. As the Irish are mostly native speakers of English, they're entitled to use the NHS. They may be assumed to have no challenges accessing services, but some of the studies I looked at showed that there were difficulties in access and barriers to accessing services. Now, the Irish do not all have low socioeconomic status. This is one of the key drivers of poor health, but instead there are two distributions of socioeconomic status of the Irish in Britain. One well-educated professional class and another less educated manual class. And it's the latter group who have the greater health needs, but they are ignored when interactions between socioeconomic status and ethnicity are not considered. So in summary, there may be an underlying view in British society that Ireland is more similar than different due to proximity, colonial history, common language, and whiteness. There could be an incorrect view that Ireland still belongs to Britain, and therefore its immigrants don't need to be monitored. And these reasons combine to leave Ireland off the agenda when examining health inequalities. So in conclusion, there is a decline over time, but interest in the health of Irish in Britain has not disappeared. The literature shows the Irish are still disadvantaged in key measures of health, so mortality, suicide, and alcohol use, and they may be worsening in others, like dementia. Surveys need to include the Irish in their samples in large enough numbers to allow statistical comparisons and recognise that not all Irish people are white. Researchers need to report on these groups in their findings where they are available, and they should cross-reference between gender and socioeconomic status because there are important differences that are hidden if you don't do that. I argue that funders who are interested in ethnic inequalities must not exclude the Irish from their calls, as doing so is based on false assumptions. If a group is left out from study, its ability to call for policy change is limited. Policymakers and health and social care providers should recognise that the Irish in Britain are an ethnic minority group with specific histories and traditions that need to be adjusted for. Failure to recognise the distinctiveness of the Irish in Britain can lead to failure to address the serious disadvantages experienced by some in this group, particularly the less affluent. This review has demonstrated the importance of including Irish people in Britain in health research. More work is needed to explore evidence for the theoretical pathways to ill health. This will point towards ways to intervene and improve outcomes. This in turn needs to be monitored by including the Irish in routinely collected data. Thank you. If you would like to follow up this paper, you can find the link there. It's open access. And if you'd like to contact me, that's my email address.